Donald Trump meets a young Navy captain. Their conversation sparks a nationwide discussion. It all started with a simple yet unexpected letter. In the endless stream of official documents, reports, and requests that pass through the White House every day, this one stood out. It wasn't from a senator, a decorated general, or a foreign diplomat. It was from a young Navy captain named Alex Carter. At just 28 years old, Alex had already made history, one of the youngest captains to ever command. But that wasn't what made this letter remarkable. It was the message itself, short, direct, and filled with an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Mr. President, I need to speak with you, not for myself, but for those who serve in silence. The words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were different. There was no mention of promotions, policies, or personal ambitions. No elaborate explanations, just a request that hinted at something deeper, something more important than rank or recognition. It was enough to make the White House staff take notice. Letters came in by the thousands, requests for meetings, appeals for change, praises, criticisms. But this one had an edge to it, a quiet force behind its simplicity. When the letter made its way to President Trump's desk, he glanced at it with mild curiosity. He had spent years meeting with military leaders, discussing strategies and sacrifices with seasoned generals and admirals. But a direct request from a young Navy captain? That was rare, almost unheard of. He leaned back in his chair, rereading the letter, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he looked up at his aides. "Who was Captain Carter?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. The room fell silent for a second before one of his advisors quickly pulled up a file. "Alex Carter, sir. 28 years old. Graduated at the top of his class. Took command at 26. Highly decorated. Respected, but also controversial." Trump narrowed his eyes slightly, intrigued. Controversial how? The aide hesitated before continuing. "There was a mission 3 years ago. A tough call had to be made. Some say it saved lives. Others say it cost too much." For a moment, Trump said nothing, tapping his fingers against the desk. He had met countless military officers before, but something about this felt different. A young captain with the audacity to reach out directly to the president, with no request for favors, no political angle, just a message that hinted at something bigger. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Let's hear what he has to say." And with that, arrangements were made. The meeting was set, and outside the walls of the White House, without anyone realizing it yet, a conversation was about to begin. One that would capture the nation's attention and spark a debate far beyond what anyone expected. The decision was made quickly, but the curiosity lingered. As the White House staff worked to arrange the meeting, Trump leaned back in his chair, still thinking about the letter. He had met world leaders, top generals, and high-ranking officials, but something about this request felt different. A young Navy captain reaching out directly, not for a promotion, not for recognition, but for something unspoken. That kind of confidence, or was it desperation, was rare, and it made him wonder. Within hours, the details were set. Captain Alex Carter was scheduled to arrive the next morning. As the news quietly spread among the White House staff, speculation began. Who was this young officer? What was so urgent that he bypassed the usual chain of command to speak directly to the president? Some dismissed it as another routine meeting, but others sensed there was more to it. The letter had been too brief, too carefully worded. Trump, never one to shy away from direct conversation, wanted answers before the meeting. He called for a full briefing. An aide handed him a file, flipping through the pages as he spoke. Alex Carter, 28 years old, graduated at the top of his class at the Naval Academy. Took command at 26. Decorated for leadership and bravery. Trump nodded, barely glancing at the papers. And the controversy? The aide hesitated for a moment. 3 years ago, in the Middle East, a mission went sideways. Captain Carter had to make a call. Some say he saved lives. Others say he sacrificed too much. Trump tapped the folder against his desk, thinking. He had heard stories like this before. Decisions made in the heat of combat, choices that haunted leaders long after the battles were over. He knew enough to understand that leadership wasn't just about victories. It was about the weight of responsibility. He exhaled slowly, then looked at his staff. "I want to hear it from him," he said. With that, the stage was set. Captain Carter was on his way to the White House, carrying with him a story that no one had yet heard, but one that was about to change everything. The next morning, under a pale gray sky, a military jet touched down at Joint Base Andrews. Captain Alex Carter stepped off, his uniform crisp, his posture rigid, but beneath the surface, his mind was racing. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than any battlefield he had ever walked. This wasn't just another mission, another debriefing. This was the White House. And on the other side of those gates, the President of the United States was waiting. Keeping a low profile, Alex moved quickly, avoiding reporters who had already started speculating about his visit. He had expected this. Nothing happened quietly in Washington. Still, he ignored the noise. The only thing that mattered was the conversation ahead. He had one chance to say what needed to be said, and he wouldn't waste it. By the time he entered the White House, the reality of where he was hit him. The hallways were lined with portraits of past presidents, men who had made decisions that shaped the world. He had studied many of them in military history, but now, for the first time, he was walking in their shadows. A staff member led him through the building until they reached the door. One deep breath. Then, the door swung open. Inside the Oval Office, President Trump stood near his desk, hands in his pockets, watching as Alex entered. The room, grand yet intimate, carried the weight of countless historical decisions. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then, Trump smirked slightly. "I've met admirals and generals, but a 28-year-old Navy captain demanding a meeting? That's new." Alex stood at attention, his voice steady. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. President." Trump gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit." Alex hesitated only a second before lowering himself into the seat, keeping his back straight. Trump leaned forward, studying him, then got straight to the point. "What does serve in silence mean?" Alex held his gaze, exhaling slowly. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind, but now that it was here, he wouldn't hide behind careful words. "It means that behind every mission, behind every decision made in combat, there are costs that no one talks about. And some of us carry those costs long after the battle is over." Trump tilted his head slightly, intrigued but unconvinced. "Go on." Alex clenched his fists under the table. He wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here because someone had to say what no one else would. And he wasn't leaving until he did. For a brief moment, Alex hesitated. Not because he was unsure of what to say, but because once he spoke these words out loud, there would be no taking them back. He had carried this weight in silence for years, buried it beneath duty and discipline. But this was why he had come. He wasn't here to protect himself. He was here to tell the truth. 3 years ago, Alex began, his voice measured but firm. "I was leading an operation overseas. It was supposed to be routine. Get in, get out, no complications." He paused, his fingers tightening slightly. But something went wrong. A miscalculation. An unexpected shift in enemy movements. "I had seconds to make a call, and I did." He swallowed hard, the memory still sharp. "We completed the mission, but not everyone made it back." His voice dropped slightly. "One of them was my second in command, my best friend, Lieutenant James Carter." Trump didn't speak. He didn't have to. The room itself seemed to absorb the weight of Alex's words. "He trusted me," Alex continued, his gaze steady but filled with something deeper, something unspoken. "He followed my orders without hesitation. And because of that, he didn't come home." He exhaled slowly, the admission like reopening a wound that had never fully healed. "I wrote the letter to his parents. I shook their hands at the funeral. I told them he was a hero, because he was." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "But I never told them the truth. That every night since that day, I lie awake wondering if there was another way. If I could have saved him." Trump finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlocked in front of him. He studied Alex, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "I understand that more than you think." Alex wasn't sure how to respond to that. The president had never served in combat. He had never stood in the middle of a battlefield, making life-and-death decisions in the blink of an eye. But then Trump spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "When you're president," he said, "every decision you make affects millions of people. People love you. People hate you. They say you're a leader when things go right and a failure when they don't. And the hardest part? He exhaled. Sometimes you never know if you made the right call. For the first time since walking into this room, Alex felt something unexpected, understanding. Leadership isn't about the medals, Alex said finally. It's not about promotions or recognition. It's about carrying the weight of the choices you can't undo. Trump gave a slight nod. And the ones you never stop thinking about. Silence settled between them again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood the burden of responsibility, no matter how different their worlds were. Alex sat back slightly, his shoulders less rigid than before. He had come to the White House expecting resistance, maybe even dismissal. Instead, he had found something else. A conversation that, for the first time in years, made him feel like he wasn't carrying this weight alone. Trump sat in silence for a moment, tapping his fingers lightly on the desk, his gaze still fixed on Alex. The weight of their conversation lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Then, almost casually, he leaned forward. "You know," he said, "I've had a lot of people sit in that chair and tell me about leadership, but very few have ever talked about the weight of it." Alex said nothing. He had never been one for empty words, and he wasn't about to start now. Trump studied him for another moment, then nodded slightly, as if making a decision. "You came here because you had something to say," he said. "So say it." Alex frowned slightly. "I just did." "Not to me," Trump said. "To them." He gestured toward the window, where the faint hum of the outside world buzzed beyond the walls of the White House. "To the country." For a second, Alex didn't move. The thought hadn't even crossed his mind. He had come here to have a conversation, not to stand in front of cameras, not to make speeches. That wasn't his job. His job was to lead his men, to make the hard calls, to carry the weight so others didn't have to. But then, in the back of his mind, he heard James' voice, clear as if he were standing beside him. "If you ever get the chance to speak up for us, do it." Alex inhaled slowly. He had spent years thinking about what he should have done differently that day. But James would have never wanted him to live in the past. He would have wanted him to do something that mattered. He exhaled, then looked back at Trump. "Are you sure about this?" Trump smirked. "You're the one who wanted to speak for those who serve in silence." Alex thought about that for a moment. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "All right, I'll do it." Outside, the media had already caught wind that something was happening. Journalists scrambled to figure out who Captain Alex Carter was, why he had been granted a private meeting with the president, and more importantly, why he was about to speak to the entire nation. The White House press briefing room was packed. Reporters filled every seat, cameras lined the back wall, and the quiet hum of anticipation filled the air. No one knew exactly what to expect. A young Navy captain, fresh from a private meeting with the president, was about to address the nation. Some thought it was a political move. Others speculated it was a military announcement. But when Alex Carter stepped up to the podium, dressed in his Navy uniform, his expression calm but firm, the room fell completely silent. He took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium for just a moment before speaking. "America honors its heroes," he began, his voice steady, "but not the ones who struggle in silence." The weight of those words settled over the room. He let them linger for a moment before continuing. "We celebrate the victories, the medals, the moments that look good on camera, but we don't talk about what happens after. The nights when soldiers stare at the ceiling, replaying decisions they can't undo. The ones who come home but never really leave the battlefield. The ones who suffer quietly because they think no one will understand." The cameras zoomed in. Every journalist in the room was focused on him now, but Alex wasn't speaking for them. He was speaking for every service member who had ever carried the burden of leadership, for every soldier who had ever felt alone in their struggle. "I wear this uniform with pride," he said, his voice unwavering. "But leadership isn't about rank. It's about responsibility. 3 years ago, I made a decision that cost a man his life. Every day since, I've carried that weight. Because that's what real leadership is. It's standing tall even when it hurts." The room remained silent. No one shuffled papers. No whispered conversations. Just the sound of his words hanging in the air, reaching beyond these walls to the millions of people watching at home. Across the country, the reaction was immediate. Some hailed him as a hero. a voice that the military had needed for years. Others questioned his motives, wondering if he was being used for a political agenda. Debates erupted on news channels, social media exploded with opinions, and within hours, the name Captain Alex Carter was trending everywhere. But Alex wasn't interested in fame or controversy. He had come here for one reason: to make sure that no soldier ever felt like they had to carry their burdens alone. And as he stepped away from the podium, he knew one thing for certain. The conversation had begun. The impact of Alex's speech spread faster than anyone had expected. Within hours, veterans and active duty soldiers began sharing their own experiences. Some spoke about the silent battles they had fought long after the war was over. Others admitted, for the first time, that they had struggled with the weight of their own decisions. Conversations that had once been avoided were now happening openly, on social media, in military circles, in the halls of Congress. The debate wasn't just about Alex anymore. It was about something much bigger: the unseen cost of service, the sacrifices that weren't written in history books. News anchors debated whether the military was doing enough for its soldiers. Families of veterans demanded answers. Lawmakers started paying attention. The pressure was building, and behind the scenes, Trump took notice. While the public argued over whether Alex was a hero or a critic, the president made a decision of his own. Without fanfare, without public announcements, he approved new funding for veteran support programs, mental health services, counseling for returning soldiers, resources for those struggling in silence. It wasn't a solution to everything, but it was a start. Days later, away from the cameras and the noise, Alex stood alone in a military cemetery. The air was still, the rows of white headstones stretching endlessly before him. He stopped at one, Lieutenant James Carter. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he placed a hand on the cold stone. "I spoke for you," he murmured, and they listened. The wind rustled the grass around him, carrying his words into the silence. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had finally done right by his friend. Alex stood there for a moment longer, staring at his friend's name carved into the stone. The weight he had carried for years hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, it felt lighter. He had done what James would have wanted. He had spoken, not for himself, but for those who had been suffering in silence for too long. As he turned to leave, he realized something. He had come to Washington as a soldier burdened by the past, but he was leaving as something more. He hadn't just told his story. He had started a conversation that could change lives. A movement had begun, not because of politics or power, but because one voice had been willing to speak the truth. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be resistance, critics, those who would try to bury the issue as just another fleeting headline. But Alex didn't care about the noise. He had done what he came to do, and now it was up to others to carry it forward. As he walked away, his final words echoed in his mind. Leadership isn't about the right choices. It's about carrying the weight of the wrong ones and making sure they lead to something greater.